So once again, welcome to those that have joined us. There are some more people in the waiting room, so people will be joining as we go. I'll try and let them in and at the same time manage a conversation with you. Welcome to this UNA Harrogate meeting. I'm delighted to have Victor Pogson here as a speaker with us tonight. You all know what the subject is because you signed up for the event. But just as a reminder, this is about rights of way, how it relates to 21st century life, and it's about our legacy from ancient ways to modern battles and all sorts of things, which was in the blurb for the event. And while people are still joining us, I thought rather than have them distracting Victor, it might be good for Sian to maybe just say a few words. I'm very conscious that the audience tonight includes many, how can I call us, climate activists, people who care about the environment and particularly about climate change. And Sian knew that. So Sian, would you like to say just perhaps a few words about why you thought this would be a subject that would be of interest to this audience?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Clive. Yeah, I think it's really vital that we protect our footpaths, our rights of way, from particularly between settlements, because if we're trying to get ourselves out of cars and fossil fuel transport, we have to find alternatives, and people are trying to a lot of people are trying to get on their feet, on their bikes, even horses, and use the old footpaths, which would have linked places like Knaresborough and Scotton, for example, and you know, villages in between. We would have walked between those places, and there are the ancient footpaths that show that, but many of them are threatened. So I felt it was really important to get somebody to talk to us about the importance of that and how those pathways are being protected. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sian. And for me, the links to climate change are so many, really, because there's that incentive to protect the countryside, and also, as you say, rambling gets us out of our cars and into the countryside. And of course, when we're doing things in nature, we're not doing other things, which may be, you know, not just transport, but we may be having pursuits that are damaging to the climate. So there are just so many reasons to promote rambling and all that it represents. So it's a delight tonight to have Victor. I've got another couple in the waiting room, so they're coming in to join us. So just say a little bit about our speaker tonight. Victor was brought up in Harrogate, so good to have you in a group that is mainly taken from your hometown in a way. Victor works for the British Horse Society as Access Field Officer for the North and Northwest of England regions. He's employed by the charity's Access Department. He works with the Society members and volunteers, looking at access, bridleways, groups, and local authority. I'm ad-libbing here a bit, Victor, so forgive me. But you'll probably say a little bit more about the things that you get involved with, and it's a great pleasure to have you with the group. So if anybody has got any questions, points that they'd like me to raise, I will monitor the chat, and if there is anything of substance to put to Victor, then I'll interrupt him politely, and he's happy to answer questions along the way. Victor's presentation will take nominally 20 minutes, depending on how long we extend it with our questions, and we'll open up the floor after the presentation for a conversation for as long as it takes, so long as I fulfill my promise to him and to you to get you away for no later than 7:30. So you'll be able to honour all those other commitments that you may have. So without any further ado, Victor, it's over to you.
Clive, thank you very much indeed. It's good to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. Interesting point from Sian's comment just now about the paths and the routes that linked towns and villages and small hamlets. I don't know if anybody's heard of it, but there's a project currently underway called Slow Ways. Have a look on, search for the website, and they are specifically trying to create a network of paths doing exactly that and linking up different settlements, and to provide an idea of a route that's suitable route that you can take if you're doing a long distance walk from A to B, rather than just going out for a Sunday stroll and doing a circular walk. So that's a very interesting one, and well worth looking into. So Clive, thank you very much for your introduction. I think you've told everybody everything they need to know. I work for the British Horse Society. I've been in this role now just for 4 months, so just about got my feet under the desk. My involvement in rights of way and access work goes back before that, though, because I have been for some time, and still am, a Footpath Secretary volunteer with the Ramblers. So I started on footpaths, and I've kind of moved up a level to bridleways, I guess, in the day-to-day job. So without further ado, let's move into the presentation. I will share my screen, and please bear with me if I'm clunky at doing that. Sometimes the computer isn't quite as quick, and sometimes I'm not quite as quick as I'd like to be. But hopefully you can now see my screen.
It's coming through, Victor. It's almost there. There we go.
It's almost there. Good.
It's there.
Okay, so have I lost you yet? Well, hopefully not yet. If I lose you at any point, do shout or something, let me know. Okay, we're going to start off by clicking. Oh, there we go. We're going to have a quiz in a moment, so that'll be a little bit of fun, give everyone a chance to get involved. Halt, who goes where? We're going to look at a little bit about the history of rights of way, and we're going to look at what actually is a right of way. We talk about rights of way, but what actually do we mean when we say that? And we're going to look at definitive maps, Countryside and Rights of Way Act, just in case you wondered what CROW stood for, and access, and I'm going to finish with a quick gallop through Highway No More 2026. So let's start off with our quiz, and if by any chance anyone happens to have any of these items nearby, Ordnance Survey maps, please put them completely out of sight before we start the quiz. Okay, so who goes where? Apart from roads, we have a variety of different rights of way, and they do show on the Ordnance Survey maps. So for each of the following pictures, no cheating, make a note of the minimum rights needed for the use shown in the picture. Okay, just 4 different pictures, and you need to pick, it's multiple choice, A to D, make a note of your answer. We'll come back and look at the answers later, and nobody will be embarrassed by getting the wrong answer.
And you don't want us to put them in the chat, Victor?
No, we don't need to put these in the chat. We'll look at them all together at the end. So here's picture number 1. So which of the options provides the minimum rights necessary for this type of use? A, B, C, or D? Okay, you only get 10 seconds. So we'll move on to number 2, and the same question. Which option provides the minimum rights necessary for this type of use? Got 5 to choose from this time. Okay, question 3. Now I've used the symbols now instead of the words, but the question's the same. Which option provides the minimum rights necessary for this type of use? We have pedestrians and wheelchair users. So those that are familiar with the Ordnance Survey map will know this.
They're getting harder, Victor.
Yeah, that's the idea, Clive. Okay, moving on. Same style of question. Which option provides the minimum rights necessary for this type of use? The ridden or led horse and the cyclist. A, B, C or D? And I think that's enough of those type of questions. So just a couple more to go. Next one is on finding your way when you're actually on one of these routes. And with the four routes, the four types of route that we've mentioned, footpath, bridleway, restricted byway, byway to open to all traffic, which way markers correspond to which type of route? So the colours are yellow, blue, plum and red. Identify them: A, C, B, D. Notice I jumbled them up there. Okay. You need more time? No? Okay, final question. Legally speaking, which of these are highways? Just put a tick by the ones that you think are highways. Okay, another couple of seconds. Right, let's move on. We'll come back to the answers shortly. And meanwhile, I think let's up the pace a little bit and have a bit of a canter through some of the fascinating background to rights of way. Our network of highways has developed over many hundreds of years. It's an amazing part of our heritage, which is often misunderstood and overlooked. Talking of interacting with the landscape, how about this from well over 350 years ago? In this case of a common field, if the highway lying in it be ill for travelling, the passengers may go into the land adjoining, and if the next land be deep, into the next to that. And if the land be enclosed and the way deep, you may break the enclosure and go on the other side. Fascinating. And it's all about rights, what you're allowed to do. Talks about the right to pass and repass in the King's Highway. Common law and statute law both impact our rights of way massively. Don't worry, I'm not going to bore you to death with case law. There is a library full of it. But here's an interesting quote from a case in 1860. And this quote's often used nowadays to sum up a very important principle which has huge relevance today, as we will see. Once a highway, always a highway. There you go. So, as far as statute law is concerned, the Blue Book, Rights of Way, A Guide to Law and Practice, lists quite a few relevant pieces of legislation. Here we go. There's that page, and there's those as well, and that doesn't include all the guidance notes and everything else. So, hope you noticed those. I'll be testing you later. Don't panic. Seriously, don't panic. So what is a right of way? Well, here's a little aerial photograph, and it's I've highlighted on there a path which I use regularly. Well used by local people. It's right next to the village. Walking the dog, taking an evening stroll, etc. The circle is about a mile round. But you know what? I don't have the right to use that path. I use it every week, but I don't have the right to use it. The path is not a public right of way. It's actually what's known as a permissive path. So I can use it by permission of the landowner, that permission could be withdrawn at any time. The right of way is not actually the physical path, the track or the road, but it's actually the right for the public to pass and repass along it. And the right might be on foot, or it might be on horseback or bicycle, or in a mechanically propelled vehicle, or a horse-drawn vehicle. And different rights of way carry the different levels of entitlement, if you like. So those are the signs which would appear on this little route, permissive footpath in this particular case. Because rights of way aren't physical, they don't often show on maps. Maps show physical features present on the ground at the time they were surveyed, but they usually can't tell us whether we have a right to actually use them. And there's a couple of disclaimers there that are shown on a couple of different types of map you may have seen. So if the map can't tell you whether you've got a right to use a way, how do you know? If there's no signage there, how do you know whether you've got the right? Well, if we look back to a time when people spent most of their lives near where they lived, it wasn't so much of a problem. You knew where you could and couldn't go. But of course, nowadays, the way that we use the great outdoors has changed a lot. And there's a much greater need for clarity and certainty around which ways can be used and by whom. There we go. Sorry, that one didn't appear as quickly as I hoped. So again, on the subject of how do you know, here's another field nearby. It's got a track clearly visible all the way along the northern and eastern perimeter, and there's a sign which is nearby. As for the location, it's adjacent to Garfield Lane, just outside Ripon, and there's a footpath that runs next to the southwestern side along a track. So in the chat, would anyone like to hazard a guess what rights exist around the northern and eastern side of this field where I put the question marks? Any suggestions? Type them in, and Clive might be able to tell me what people have suggested. Any ideas? Is there anything going in?
Victor?
Say again, sorry?
So people are thinking about it.
Thinking. Oh, we can't take time for thinking.
And I've had one that says permissive, and also that was from Rima, and Sean and Bill are suggesting none.
Interesting. Okay, well, let's move on. There's clearly a need to know what rights exist, because it's not always obvious, is it? Certainly not obvious if you go down to that field, which I pass regularly.
Now,
So,
Kirsty, sorry to interrupt, Victor.
No, go on.
Kirsty is actually thinking along the same lines that I was. I didn't type it in because you'd have heard the clatter of my keys. But Kirsty is asking, have we got rights to go round the edge if the path isn't accessible? And that's what I was thinking based on what you said earlier.
Right, we'll have a look at this in a minute. So clearly there is a need to know. And by the middle of the 20th century, it was recognised that there was a need to provide an authoritative record of rights of way. In September 1947, a report was published called the Hobhouse Report, and it recommended that all public rights of way should be surveyed and recorded on maps. And then the National Parks and Access to the Countryside Act in 1949 put that into effect with the creation of definitive maps of public rights of way. We'll come back and look at what's happening with definitive maps shortly. They were created by all county councils in England and Wales in the 1950s. So finally, after hundreds of years, rights finally began to be recorded on maps. So going back to our question about this mysterious field on Garfield Lane, we now have the benefit of referring to an online extract from the definitive map. And there it is. It's not actually the definitive map, it's an online electronic version of it. But it shows that Garfield Lane's there and the footpath up to the the southwest of the field is there, but actually there's nothing at all around the north and the east of that field. The river runs along one edge, but in the field itself where you could see that track, there's no right of way. And even better for the public, the Ordnance Survey maps now show the rights on both Land Ranger and Explorer. And again, there's nothing there shown for our track. And actually, the track is private. There is no permission for use by the public. The sign, that was a bit of a red herring because it actually indicates a rideway for horses that are kept on this landowner's livery yards. So you might see a horse using the tracks, but that doesn't mean that you're entitled to do so yourself. If you walk there, you are actually committing trespass against the landowner. There's no right to be there. So well done, Sean. I think you got that one right.
So Victor, Kirsty and I thinking that perhaps we could use it if the actual path was blocked. We're wrong.
If the actual path was blocked, you do have the right to go around the obstruction. If the path's blocked by the landowner, you have the right to go around the obstruction, provided you remain on land within the same ownership. But only so far as is necessary to get around the obstruction.
So we were half right then.
Yeah, I wouldn't say you've got the right to go around the other side of that field completely, but yeah, you've got a valuable point that you raise. Okay, let's move along. How do rights of way actually come into being? How do we get them? And the answer is broadly because they're actually given to us. So you can begin to see why they're so valuable. When a landowner gives the public a right to use the way, this is normally referred to as dedicating a right. And it can happen in a couple of ways. We've got, first of all, express dedication, in which the landowner specifically shows his intention to dedicate that right of way to the public, often by a written deed. It's also got to be shown that the public have actually accepted that by using it. The second type of dedication is called presumed dedication. In this case, it's kind of the other way around because the public has used the way and the landowner's done nothing to show that he doesn't intend them to be able to do so. And what comes into play here is sometimes called the 20-year rule. You may have heard of this. Under the 20 years rule, as defined in the Highways Act, a right of way can come into being if it's used for 20 years by the public. There are some important points. First of all, public actually have to use it. Doesn't matter why, but there must have been usage of the path. Secondly, it must have been by the public, not just, for example, by employees or customers of the landowner, but by the wider public. Must have been used without interruption. So in other words, the landowner did nothing to block it and to tell the public they couldn't use it. Or the period of 20 years wasn't interrupted by, a gap. And the public must use the way as of right. What that means is it actually carries a principle derived from Roman law. So this is really ancient stuff. And these three phrases come into play to define whether you use the path as of right. Nec v, which means without force. So in other words, you didn't have to open the gate, force the gate open, climb over a fence or something like that. Nec clam, which means without secrecy. So in other words, you didn't use this way for 20 years only on dark nights or foggy afternoons when nobody could see you. And nec precario, in other words, you didn't have permission to use it. So it doesn't actually speak to what you believe about your rights, but the way in which you acted. In other words, you acted as if you had the right to use it. Now, please note, criminal use cannot give rise to acquisition of rights. So for example, if you walk on land owned by Network Rail, you will never acquire the right because it's illegal to actually do that. But interestingly, this 20 years rule is used quite a lot. For example, I'm working on a case near Wigan at the moment where horse riders have used a route for at least 30 years that we know of. This year, the farmers stopped them from doing so, so we plan to claim the right of way on horseback. In other words, to claim a bridleway at that point. So turning it round and looking at it perhaps from the landowner's perspective, how might a landowner prevent a right of way from coming into existence across his land? Suggestions in chat, please. Does anyone have any idea? What could a landowner do if he doesn't want the public to acquire these rights over a 20-year period? What could he do? Clive, call out any ideas that are being suggested for me, if you would, please. Any suggestions what a landowner might do?
So items that are popping in include fencing and notices, signs, physical obstructions, putting lots of livestock in there.
I like that one.
Registering with North Yorkshire County Council, letting us.
Okay, who's the expert? Who's the expert in the room? Own up now. Yeah, absolutely right. They're all, you know, you're on the right lines with all of those. You know, lock a gate. Physically prevent the public from using it. Even if you just lock the gate one day a year, that prevents continuous use from taking place. Put up a sign. No public right of way. Make it clear to the public. That one about lodging a declaration with the county council, absolutely spot on. It's possible to do that, stating these are the existing rights of way on my land and I have no intention of dedicating any further ones. And that can be lodged with the local highway authority, in this case, North Yorkshire County Council. Or even this one, remember our permissive footpath sign. Even putting that up makes it very clear to the public, and it's all about making it clear to the public that they don't have the right to use this particular route, but you're happy for them to use it with permission, but obviously permission can be withdrawn at any time. So that's a little look at it from the opposite side. The second way in which public rights of way come into being is the legal route, if you like. It's by order, legal order, or by agreement under statutory powers. Local authorities can make path creation orders or enter into creation agreements with the landowner, can even pay compensation for doing that. And local councils also have powers to enter into creation agreements, although they do have some limitations. But that's the second route. But let me ask you a question. How many new rights have you seen in the area where you live? Let's see everybody, but a show of hands. Has anybody seen any rights? Or put a comment in if you're not on camera. Shan gave me a big fat 0 then. Has anybody seen any new rights of way come into being? Other than that, I'm getting Clive shaking his head vigorously. I have to say, in the time that since I started working in rights of way, I've never seen one either. I've seen diversion. Block one off and create a new one.
Victor, Rika has made the point only when they're diverted.
Exactly. Those are the only ones that I've seen, Clive, where you extinguish it in one path and create a new replacement. But yeah, it's just a diversion.
Christopher Dunn has said none in 50 years in Gloss. I'm not quite sure what Gloss is, whether that's Gloucester or Glossop or...
No.
but
no,
not in 50 years.
Absolutely. Creation from scratch is very rare. Yeah. Absolutely rare. So although it is possible, perfectly possible, there are very relatively straightforward ways of doing it. Realistically, it doesn't happen.
Yeah, Alex Minute has said Running Park has added new permissive paths.
Yeah, but permissive paths, like the one that I talked about earlier, can disappear overnight. They're ephemeral.
Yes.
And unfortunately, I mean, that raises an interesting point, which isn't scripted here, but a number of years ago, government introduced a scheme to persuade landowners to create paths and routes on their land through the higher level stewardship scheme, and they paid them. So of course all these new routes appeared because the farmers were getting paid to create them, but they were all permissive. The scheme paid them money for 10 years, and then suddenly at the end of 10 years the scheme stopped paying the cash and all the permissive routes disappeared.
There's one question here that I'm going to ask Robert Barker if he would like to unmute and put the question to you himself, because it's very interesting and it might begin a conversation between the two of you. So, Robert, would you like to unmute and talk to Victor?
Go ahead, Robert.
I thought in creating some of the national trails, like the Pembrokeshire Path and the South West Path, there had to be new rights of way and to join it up, and some were created.
Possibly so. Some are created as new rights of way, and some are just permissive. I mean, I'm not familiar intimately with any of the national trails. We don't have any going through Ripon, but we do have things like the Ripon Rowell. And when the Ripon Rowell was created, it used a combination of rights of way and permissive paths. So even though there's a long distance route there, it's a 50-mile route, it's not all on public rights of way. And it's shown on the map, but it's not all on public rights of way. So yeah, interesting one, and probably one worth exploring in more detail for national trails. Good question, thank you. Let's turn it around. We've not got any nearby examples of new rights of way being created from scratch. So how many public rights of way are being lost? And sadly, I think the answer is quite a lot, primarily because of development. And here's an example of an area in Ripon near where I live, that's been developed over probably a total of about 50 years. And you can see the blue dashed line there. That used to be a footpath, and that actually used to be open fields. Obviously, at some point during the ongoing development, the footpath was extinguished and the countryside was extinguished, and it's all concreted over and it's gone forever. So I'm sure that I'm not the only one that's familiar with paths, rights of way that have actually been lost. So it seems like it's a bit of one-way traffic. Question is, what can we do about it? The network is diminishing. So time for some brainstorming, I think, just in case anyone else has fallen asleep.
Victor, before the brainstorming, Christine has asked a question that I think is probably important at this point.
Please go ahead.
The question is, are city trails new rights of way?
I don't know. Can you identify a specific one that you have in mind?
Do you want to unmute, Christine?
I can say green paths in, well, through city centres. London, they have lots of green trails now through London. I just wonder if they are part of the same thing.
Short answer, I don't know for certain. To elaborate on that, you'd need to check. They may or may not be. They may use an existing highway, whether it's, you know, the footway beside a road, which is part of the highway that's dedicated for pedestrians to use. So in city centres, obviously, there's a lot of that, which is public right of way, but not quite in the sense of footpaths and bridleways that we're talking about. It's part of the carriageway. Yeah, Yeah, interesting question. Worth looking at though for any of these things. I mean, I mentioned.
Does it depend a bit on land ownership? You know, whether it's government owned, forestry commission owned, or
yeah.
I think the whole thing we need rights of way because the land is owned by somebody, presumably.
Yeah, well, that's right. Yeah,
and I think
most of the land
that's quite an interesting thing in the first place.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's a lot of issues that you touch on there, and we haven't got time to go into any of them in depth tonight. But you know, forestry commission land that's owned by the Crown or by local authorities, some fascinating rights of way queries that come across my desk every day. But yeah, useful question, but well worth looking at, particularly, for example, you know, going back to mention the Ripon Ramblers and the fact that parts of that are not actually rights of way. We're currently exploring in Ramblers whether it's possible to actually have some of those claimed under the 20-year rule. If people have used them as of right, they're not signed up as permissive. There's nothing to prevent them from using them, so people do seem to have used them as of right. We're looking at that one. Interesting.
Yeah, thank you.
So, any other suggestions then? What we might be able to do to stem this tide of lost rights of way? Answers on a postcard or in chat or on a postage stamp? Any other suggestions? Gives me time to look at what and see.
Find out why people aren't using them.
Yeah, absolutely. Why aren't people using them? Yeah.
I suppose building on things that you've already said, Victor, finding out when paths have been used and trying to get them made formal rights of way.
Yeah, absolutely. Talk to landowners. Surprisingly, landowners, one assumes that landowners absolutely don't want people walking across their land, but it's not necessarily the case. Some landowners are actually open to the suggestion if it can be done in a way that works for them. And you know, there's no reason not to try and find mutually beneficial solutions to these issues. My colleague, who's chair of Ripon Ramblers, was recently walking near the village and talked to a landowner, and he said, "Yeah, I'm actually thinking of putting in a permissive path. Now we need to take that one step further and see if we can turn that into an actual public right of way." But it was a good start.
There's all sorts coming into the chat now, Victor. You've opened the floodgates.
Have I opened the floodgates? Excellent. I'm glad the old brain cells are working.
I won't attribute them to everybody, or I'll be here all day, but we're getting things like keep walking the paths, use them, reopen historic routes, apply for a DMMO to
thank you.
Stay a pro. This is Rita, so I don't.
The person that said DMMO, Clive, the person that said DMMO can come and take over the talk now.
Rita, unmute yourself if you wish.
No, definitely not. I'm here and I'm listening and very interested. I've learned already a lot. Thank you.
Spot on with that DMMO suggestion.
Apply and be ready to wait for a long time.
That as well. Dead right.
Christopher Dunn has also made the point that every parish council must have a dedicated highway officer.
Wouldn't that be great? If the parish councils all took an interest, that would be a real help. Good point.
As a parish council, sorry to interrupt, I was going to say, parish councils don't have any statutory powers.
No.
We have soft power, which all depends on, in our case, North Yorkshire County Council, engaging with the parish council, which we haven't been successful in our parish. But we keep trying.
It is possible for parish councils to enter into a creation agreement with a landowner, but it's not a particularly satisfactory route to getting a new right of way, because you don't have the power to pay compensation, so the landowner probably won't be interested. And the second disadvantage to it is that the path that's created would not automatically then be maintained at the public expense. So in other words, the county council wouldn't pay for maintaining it. So it's not an ideal solution. But nonetheless, if the parish council is keen and they can work with other organisations and with landowners, and there are ways that rights can be created.
I suppose a big question, Victor, and do tell us if we're milking your question, but building on what Sian said right at the beginning about getting people out of their cars and using other forms of transport, be it horses, cycles, walking, is there anything that we can do by way of lobbying on the premise that we're trying to join up routes to make it easier for people to get from A to B?
Yeah, within the methods that exist by which we can add rights of way, the council, in other words, North Yorkshire County Council, have a kind of triaging system by which they prioritise the applications, and something like linking routes would give an application a much higher position in the list, if you like. They would look at that a lot sooner than they would look at something that goes nowhere. So that's definitely something to consider, and all these things put together, you know, it's this is one of the main focuses of the work of Ramblers Footpaths secretaries and officers, is all about protecting, preserving and enhancing the rights of way network. We're going to talk shortly about some of the work we're doing in DMMOs, which someone's already mentioned, adding rights of way to the map, which I'll talk about shortly. And one of the things that Ramblers is doing there is they're prioritising routes which do exactly that. They create links between different places, or they contribute to circular routes, or they're otherwise useful rather than just being random. So yeah, we're certainly looking at that.
Yeah, the comments are flooding in, but I'm conscious of your time, Victor. So
I'm conscious of my time as well, Clive. Well, basically, those things that we've said, talking with landowners can be productive. There's a new path that was dedicated because the need was perceived. It was done by an agreement with the council. Another interesting one, which I don't know if anybody else has put it in the chat, obviously, because I haven't seen that, but under section 106 of the Town and Country Planning Act, developers can be required as a condition of planning to make contributions to the community, and those funds can actually be used towards local infrastructure projects, such as new multi-user rights of way, for example, diverting a right of way that might have been lost onto a new route around, say, the perimeter of a development, or like this one here, creating a new route completely. This one's down in Berkshire, but they actually created, and you know, shout out to Crest Homes, they created over 2 kilometres of new bridleways within the development. Bridleways, of course, as you remember, not just horses that can use them. We can use them on foot, we can use them on bicycles. I've just given you the answer to one of those quiz questions, so don't go back and change it. You know, so there are opportunities, and you know, when developments happen, it's not necessarily bad news, provided that we are getting in there, provided that we are doing the lobbying that you mentioned, Clive, that we're responding to planning applications and actually seeking what we're looking for, and making sure that, you know, these environmentally friendly, if you like, greenways, call them multi-user routes, call them what you like, but create a right of way that can be used by non-motorised users. That's the bottom.
Chris Burford has asked Victor, who is actually responsible for the upkeep of a right of way? He also asks about, is it an area for public involvement? I think you've answered that already, but who's formally responsible for the upkeep?
Okay, I'll give you that very quickly. For the surface of a path, the Highway Authority, which in this area is North Yorkshire County Council. For anything coming in from the sides, like overgrowing vegetation, overhanging trees, the landowner. For the gates and stiles where they exist, the landowner, although the county council will often help towards costs. That's a very, very short summary. In most cases, the responsibility for ensuring that the right-of-way is unobstructed and in good repair is down to the council. Sometimes that responsibility involves them telling the landowner to make it right. Sometimes it involves them doing it themselves. Sometimes, if the landowner doesn't cooperate, it even involves the council doing it themselves and then sending him the bill. But the responsibility lies with the council. The actual duty might be with the landowner, just depending.
Rita is thanking you ever so much because this is helpful, and she asks about signposts. Is it the county council?
Yeah, signposts is the county council. Yeah, there's supposed to be a signpost everywhere that a right of way meets a metalled road. So wherever a footpath goes off a road, or a bridleway, or a byway for that matter, there's supposed to be. They usually use a finger post, or sometimes they use those green blocks. But there's supposed to be one at every point. Waymarking along the route is also the responsibility of the highway authority. We do have to bear in mind highway authorities have a very much reduced and very limited budget and resources, and increasingly they are using volunteers to help with some of these minor maintenance tasks, replacing signs, waymarks, etc., clearing some vegetation, cutting the surface growth on the path. And that's something which actually at Ripon Ramblers we're starting to get involved with. But they do use increasing volunteer assistance for exactly that type of thing. Okay, I'm sure let's crack on. We're cantering rapidly through that. Somebody mentioned local plans, lobbying. You know, we need to ensure that we are responding when a local plan or a rights of way improvement plan or a local cycling and walking infrastructure plan is being discussed. There's one ongoing in Ripon right now. Worth looking out for these things and contributing. Okay, so let's come back to that definitive map that we were talking about that began to be created in the 1950s. And of course, it isn't entirely complete. The way in which it was compiled, and I won't go into the details now, but that resulted in quite a large number of rights of way being omitted from the definitive map. Some of those rights of way have completely disappeared on the ground. You can't see that they ever existed. Others are in regular use, but they're not actually recorded as rights at all, or they might be recorded with the wrong status. For example, they show on the definitive map as a footpath, but really they ought to be a bridleway because that's how they were used in the past. Now that was no great problem at the time because provisions were made to modify the map by claiming rights of way that existed but weren't shown. And in fact, many of them have been added since the first definitive maps were produced back in the 1950s. So we can add them to the map, these lost ways. Which brings me on to talking about Crow, the Countryside and Rights of Way Act 2000. Who remembers that? Well, if you do, you'll recall that this was the legislation which brought us open access land, the right to roam on some hills and moorland, things like that. It also introduced rights of way improvement plans and local access forums, and a number of other delights to keep rights of way people busy. However, Crow also introduced a cut-off day on 1st of January 2026 when various public rights will be extinguished. Basically, that means most public rights of way which existed prior to 1949 and are not shown on the definitive map will cease to exist the day after cut-off day. That principle that we mentioned at the beginning of once a highway, always a highway, has, in my opinion, been trampled underfoot. We will wake up on the 2nd of January 2026 with potentially thousands of miles of paths which we no longer have the right to use. Ramblers carried out an exercise last year to identify these potential lost paths and found around 40,000 miles of unrecorded ways. So what does that mean? Well, here's a map of a small area near the village where I live, and I've highlighted in green the current rights of way shown on the definitive map. That's what we've got at the moment. They're completely safe. But however, just look at the lost ways that we've identified in red. If we can claim some or all of those before the deadline, we will have a far better network for use in the future. If we do nothing, we guarantee that those will be lost forever, but we may be able to claim some of them. In North Yorkshire as a whole, total mileage of lost ways, well, is over 2,000 kilometres anyway, so that's a lot of paths. And of course, time is short. The countdown to 2026, 1st of January, is rapidly approaching. There's not long to deal with this. So what can we do about it? And the answer is we make a DMMO application. And for anyone who doesn't know what that stands for, it's a tongue twister, which stands for Definitive Map Modification Order. And basically what it means is we identify that a path is not shown or not shown correctly on the definitive map, and we make an application for an order to change the map to reflect what the correct position should be. We collect evidence, package it up together, create an application form, send it off to the council, and then, as somebody commented, in quite a number of years, they finally get round to having a look at it. They assess the evidence, and if the evidence shows that the balance of probability is in favour of the fact that the right does exist, they will then make an order for it to be added to the definitive map. The landowner will then most likely appeal, and it will go to the planning inspectorate, and there'll be an inquiry, and eventually, sometime in the future, probably after I've retired, they will decide whether or not the new path gets added to the map. So that's what happens, and I would heartily recommend the book Rights of Way Restoring the Record, which goes into great detail about how this process can be done. But what evidence do we need? Well, there's not going to be many people around who can say that they've used these paths in the 20 years prior to 1949. Sadly, time has passed. So we're going to have to rely on historical evidence. And just to finish this evening, let's have a really quick gallop. Let's up the pace again and gallop through some of the available evidence sources that we have. Enclosure Records, I'm sure you all recognise that as Bishop Monckton from 1816, don't you? We're looking for the evidence that the route we are claiming existed. So enclosure awards, which set out public carriage roads, private roads, bridleways and footpaths, can be very helpful. And those type of historic documents are usually held in county record offices or down at the National Archives at Kew. They're legal documents, so they carry a lot of weight as evidence. If they show the right of way, they carry a lot of weight as evidence. And there's a map, and then there's the actual enclosure award in a handwritten script, which takes quite a lot of effort sometimes to understand. Tithe records also available at county record offices in the National Archives. One award for each parish or tithe district, again comprising a map and what's known as an apportionment. So there's a copy of an apportionment. I can't tell you where that was from because I can't read the writing, it's too small. Some rare cases, such as Cheshire, these documents have actually been digitised and georeferenced, so you can see them as an overlay on a modern map. And that makes life easy. But for most of them, it's a trip to the archives office. And one more, 1910, two more. National 1910 Finance Act, which was an exercise that was carried out to value land throughout the country by the Inland Revenue, and the maps that were drawn up to accompany that can show us, because the rights of way weren't considered taxable, so they're shown as the little white roads, and that's great evidence that this particular route was actually a road rather than just part of someone's property. And finally, old maps. I love old maps, as I've already admitted. It's a favourite type of evidence for me, although sadly it carries quite a low influence, carries little weight as evidence, simply because a map just reflects what existed on the ground at the time it was surveyed. And as I mentioned before, it doesn't actually tell you about rights, although it can contribute to the overall picture that indicates that this route existed. Here's a quick selection from an application that I submitted to Lancashire County Council in April. We're looking at this little white road that runs across just above the river and connects the two brown roads together. Fortunately, most of these old maps are now available online, and the National Library of Scotland's got a fantastic archive which you can access totally free of charge. So there's the route again on a different scale map. That's the one from 1848. There's one from 1898. It's still there. Doesn't look quite the same, but it's still the same route nonetheless. Here's a Bartholomew Map. Again, that was 1906, and still shows the route as being there. It's shown in white as Bartholomew, so it wasn't recommended to cyclists, but taken together, all that map evidence gives a little bit of weight to the claim that this was more than just a footpath, because at the moment that particular route is recorded as a public footpath and nothing more. I contend it should show as a restricted byway. Okay, so that concludes this whistle-stop tour, this gallop through the evidence, and here's what we covered in the whole of this cross-country. Once a highway, always a highway. A little bit of the history of rights of way. What is a right of way? Something intangible, but something valued, something very important. We looked at definitive maps, we looked at the Countryside and Rights of Way Act and Access Land, and we looked at the dangers faced by our rights of way and the threat posed in 2026. Highway no more, or saved posterity. So I'm happy to take any further questions. While you have a chance to gather your thoughts, perhaps we ought to look at the answers to our quiz from the very beginning. Okay, and here we go. Question number 1, what can these happy people on their carriage use? What's the minimum rights necessary? And the answer is restricted byway, C. So pat yourself on the back if you got that one right. A bridleway can be used by a ridden or led horse, but if you've got something attached to the back of the horse, you need a restricted byway. Okay, what about our car in the countryside? The answer is a byway open to all traffic. Our pedestrians and wheelchair users can use a public footpath. Even though normally wheeled vehicles can't use a footpath, there is obviously an exception for wheelchairs and mobility vehicles, mobility scooters. And number 4 was our horse, rider and cyclist, and I think I gave this one away earlier. The answer is needs to be at least a public bridleway. If you ride a bicycle or even push a bicycle or lead a horse on a public footpath, you are actually committing trespass against the landowner unless you've got his permission to do that. Question number 5, matching the arrows, the way marking arrows to the route type. Those are the answers. Footpath is yellow, bridleway is blue, restricted byways in that purple or plum colour. The byway open to all traffic is red, usually faded to pink. And the last question is almost a trick question. Legally speaking, they're all highways under the definition of the 1980 Highways Act.
Fantastic. Well, I hope
There we go. That's me.
Hope everybody else did better than I did, Victor. And thank you so much for your presentation, and thank you also for stopping sharing it so that we can all see you, and hopefully, if I just switch to gallery view, we can see each other. There are some questions that are in the chat that we didn't get to because I was conscious of interrupting you too often as you were going through your presentation. But how would you like to play that? Would you like people to unmute and talk to you for a little while? Or
by all means. By all means, let's, yeah. Clive, if you want to sort of compare it and people raise their hands or do the online hand raise and then we don't all shout at once. But yeah, give some questions.
A real hand raise. Well, Rita has got a question. She's the first in with a yellow Zoom hand raise. So Rita, why don't you put your question to Victor?
Hi, and well, thank you very much, Victor. This was really helpful and very informative.
Thank you.
I have a couple of questions. They're quite specific because here in South Milford, we're trying to, well, improve our paths and reinstate lost paths. We're starting that process.
Excellent.
So I have a couple of questions. One is, how can we access that 1910 Finance Act? Because it's not online, but how can we get a copy of that? And secondly, you mentioned some documents like the tithe maps that should be in the county archives. Can we just go and ask, can I have the tithe map for South Milford Parish, or is there a specific process that we have to follow? Thank you.
You can, some of these historical documents have been photographed by some of the organisations that are involved in the 2026 research. So, for example, the Ramblers and in particular the British Horse Society that I work for, and we have created an online library which has some of those documents available, not necessarily all of them, and certainly not all of them for every county. And of course, with the pandemic, the archives have been largely closed for almost a year and a half. So we haven't been able to progress that work very much recently. The archives are now starting to open up. You can contact the county archive, you can contact the National Archive at Kew and make an appointment in most cases to actually visit. You can't just turn up, you need to make an appointment. It helps if you know exactly which documents you want to see in advance. You can pre-order them, take your camera, don't take a lot of time whilst you're there actually reading them, get good photographs to take away and then look at them, study them later. So that's the way to do it. If you want to contact me after the meeting or over the next few days, I'll be happy to share links because the BHS has made their archive libraries available to the public. So if you're actually involved in researching, you know, that information is accessible. Also,
that's great. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, one more, interestingly, a commercial website, thegenealogist.com, they have online tithe records. Their subscription, unfortunately, is over £100 a year. But if you're interested in family research and you're a member of the genealogist, then you've got access to some tithe records as well.
Any other questions for Victor? Or Victor, would you like to have a look down some of the ones in the chat? Can you see there? Sian has raised a hand.
Yeah, regarding the date, Victor, as I think Rita pointed out, we can send stuff into, say, a DMMO to North Yorkshire Council, and they might take ages. What happens if they get clogged up with stuff and they haven't done it all by the date, and it's not our fault? They're just sitting on it, or they can't get through it, or they haven't got the staff to do it, or something.
Super question, Sian. Thank you very much for that. The answer is that we believe that provided the application has been submitted correctly, you know, a valid application has been submitted before that date, then we are safe. Yes, they will take a lot longer than 1st of January 2026 to get through this. All councils have a backlog. The amount of that backlog varies between about 6 years and 150 years.
Oh God.
So, you know, when I said I might be retired, I might be long dead and buried. But I mean, obviously, part of what the representative charities, the Ramblers and the BHS, the Open Spaces Society, part of our work also involves lobbying, for an extension to the deadline, although there's no guarantee of getting that, so we have to assume that we won't, and also for resources in local authorities to actually deal with this backlog.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of campaigning on that. But yeah, great question. But I noticed that somebody says that the bridleway photo showed a barbed fence. I didn't notice that. I'll have to look more closely. I can get my magnifying glass out to my pictures. Yeah, potentially it is a no-no. That was Christopher, wasn't it? It is a bit of a no-no. If it's on the side away from the public, might be all right. Something to perhaps discuss with the County Council Rights of Way Department. Certainly you can't have it across the right of way. The number of stiles that I could tell you about around here that have got a strand of barbed wire across, that's a big no-no. It should be either covered or just not be there, but certainly not across a stile. We particularly don't like it on bridleways because, of course, you know, horses don't necessarily always just walk in a straight line. Good question. What else have we got? Yeah, we only have to apply by 2026. That's right. Any fees associated with the process? Great question. The answer is no. Putting the 2026 applications in doesn't actually cost anything. In fact, I'll let you into a secret. If you create an application that is valid and it's submitted and all correctly submitted, and you send a copy of it to the British Horse Society, if it's for a bridleway or a byway, British Horse Society will cover your expenses up to £100.
I think you raise a really important point there, Victor, and I was thinking of this when the question came in, and again, I didn't wish to interrupt you, but of course, if you really care and want to put the best, most professional application that's got the best chance of getting through, presumably there is merit in hiring professionals to work on your behalf for it, and I'm guessing that in those circumstances, some parties would crowdfund or raise funds to make sure they have the best success.
Yeah, I'm not aware of anyone sort of doing that task commercially, but I mentioned the Green Book earlier, and I don't know if you can see that. Restoring the Record doesn't show up very well when you've got a background, does it? But that's what we call the Green Book. Restoring the Record by Sarah Bucks and Phil Wadey, and that's a heavy book. You know, that's 400 pages of information about how to do this, how to research the evidence, how to prepare an application and submit it. And their recommendation is the best, is really, as you say, Clive, the best way to do it is to put the application form, don't just add the evidence, but explain what the evidence shows and what the relevance of that is and how that contributes to your claim. And that way, when somebody objects to the application, it gets sent to the planning inspectorate, the whole explanation is there, and you don't have to then rush in 2 weeks to throw together a thing for the planning inspector. British Horse Society is willing to help people who are wanting to submit applications. We've recently introduced a completely new class of volunteer, if you like, called a 2026 researcher. Unlike the rest of our bridleway officers who do everything from, you know, electric fences to holes in the ground, 2026 researcher is just a volunteer role specifically doing this work. And we have the ability to check through your application, make sure it's presentable, make sure it's valid, because there are hoops to jump through. It's not as straightforward as you might like to think. Sadly, I've seen applications that have been submitted by either a parish council or a member of the public who just didn't realise exactly what was required. They were sent an application form, so they filled it in and returned it, and they attached some photographs and a map, but they didn't realise the sort of the standard of evidence that's required, and sadly the applications were thrown out. So yeah, there is expertise available. Any other questions I've missed?
Yeah, I was going to say, have a look down. There's some more recent ones that have come in. I don't want to presume to select them for you, Victor, so maybe pick one or two at the most to answer before we round up.
Christopher, your comment about rural councils, parish councils being stacked with landowners, yeah, absolutely right. No further comment on that. But you'll notice, well, okay, slight further comment. You'll notice that some parishes seem to have a lot of rights of way, some seem to have hardly any, and there's an obvious reason for it. Having looked at all the planning applications I've looked at in 50 years, most developers lie when asked, does this development affect a public right of way? Well, I couldn't possibly comment on that, but I've also looked at a lot of planning applications, and surprisingly, they never seem to mention that public right of way, do they? Yeah. I think that will probably about cover it.
Well, we've got a couple of hands up. Oh no, one is an applause from Sian and Bill. And Rita, why don't you offer a last question in?
Hi, sorry, I don't want to take over, but I'm finding it really helpful for us. So my question is, you mentioned that it was evidence of 20 years of use. Is it 20 years of use in the past from the 1950s back?
No.
So 1950s or 20 years in the since today, from today
Yeah.
to the back? Yeah.
Great question, thank you. It gives me a good chance to explain and clarify that one. The 20 years rule is a continuous period of 20 years, counting backwards from the time when use was brought into question. So, for example, that might be the landowner put in a locked gate to prevent people from using it. So from that date, 20 years backwards. So if you did that in 2021, you need evidence of use from 2001 to 2021.
Okay, that's really helpful then.
So that can be used.
There is no obstruction. So imagine there's a path that everyone's using, and
Yeah.
there's never been an obstruction, but it's not an official public right of way.
Yeah.
So in that case, it's that rule of the 20 years, does it also apply for
Yes, it
evidence
does.
statements?
So
Okay.
yeah, if you have a route and you want to use the 20 years presumed dedication, to use the correct term, then you need a continuous period of 20 years. It's going to be easiest to get that in recent years because the people are still going to be around who've used it during that time. It doesn't have to be one person that used it for the whole 20 years,
Yeah.
but it needs to be a number of people, and the overall picture needs to show that it was used throughout that entire period.
Okay, no, that's really helpful. And I would just like to
Right.
add as a suggestion,
Go
as a
ahead.
parish council, I think parish councils might not necessarily be aware of the situation with paths and that what can they do about it, because I definitely wasn't. And it's not because of lack of interest, it's just it's not in the manual of the good parish councillor.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
my suggestion is, if you could engage with parish councils, even if it's just a leaflet, so that people are aware, so that when applications come in from members of the public wanting parish council support, the parish councillors know that they can actually support it, and it does make a difference, because
Yep.
I didn't know this in the past, and I'm sure many others don't.
I completely agree with you. Absolutely right. It's a great suggestion, and I might even try to take that on board. I mean, I cover 53 planning authorities throughout 9 counties, and literally hundreds of parish councils. So I may not be able to write to them all, but it's certainly a good point that you raise. It's well worth parish councils being aware, and they can be a great help. Parish councils are great, especially when there's a problem, when there's a blocked and obstructed right of way. The council's far more likely to take notice. NYCC will react far better if it comes from a parish councillor than if it just comes from Joe Public.
So Victor, I know that was supposed to be the last question, but as Sian kindly invited you, I think I need to give her the opportunity to ask one very quick last question, and hopefully ask for an equally rapid answer. Sian.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just thinking about when these applications get to, say, North Yorkshire County Council. Yeah. What is the kind of presumption? I mean, surely there should be a presumption in favour of public rights of way, but I bet that's not the case, especially in North Yorkshire. No. And can we get something through to government, to Parliament, to push for a presumption for local authorities to be presuming on behalf of the welfare of public and in view of climate change?
Short answer is these are decided purely on the evidence. So it's whether the evidence shows that on the balance of probabilities a right exists or it doesn't exist. Out of the various different sources of evidence that we've mentioned, when the definitive maps were first created back in the 50s, the one thing that the highway authorities did not have available to them at the time was the 1910 Finance Act records. So that is new evidence to them. So they are gold dust. They are our kryptonite when it comes to putting an application in, but they are purely decided on the basis of evidence. I've had situations where a landowner has said, this is entirely inappropriate to put a footpath or bridleway through here. It would disturb the butterflies, or it would be right in front of my patio window. And actually that makes no difference at all. It's entirely irrelevant because we're discussing whether the right actually exists and whether the evidence supports that claim.
Victor, thank you so much for responding to all those questions. Apologies to anybody who we didn't get to. There's virtual applause and all sorts of thanks coming in, so it's been wonderful. I think I would like to just end with one comment, if I may, and feel free, Victor, to add to it. And that is, as Sian was alluding, we are moving into uncharted territory with the climate emergency and rights of way, be they footpaths or cycle paths or bridleways. are going to become increasingly important as we join alternative modes of transport together to help take fossil fuel vehicles off the road. So there are probably going to be other opportunities to influence the politics of this going forward, and I think that those of us that wish to should certainly get involved. And I think there's also room for a new vision emerging. I mean, when we think of all the new forms of transport like electric scooters and electric bikes and everything else, our transport highways are going to change shape over the years to come. So with that sort of climate change agenda in mind, would you like to offer any hope and comment to the audience that we've got here, which includes several climate activists, to maybe send us off with some hope and vigour in our efforts? So Victor, just a final comment from you, and then we'll let everybody go as promised.
Thanks, Clive. Yeah, I agree. I think probably the comment that I would make is inclusivity. That we've had a problem, and we in the BHS are acutely conscious that we have this situation where cyclists are wanting cycleways and pedestrians are wanting footpaths and horse riders want bridleways. And what we need to be looking at is routes that are suitable for everyone. So whatever your preferred mode of sustainable transport actually is, that you can use the routes that are created. There's no point putting in a cycleway alongside a busy road where the horse rider isn't allowed to use the cycleway, so the horse rider has to use the now more narrow bit of road with the juggernauts on the right, cyclists coming flying past on the left, recipe for disaster. But what can be done is you can create a multi-user path off the carriageway which everyone can use. So inclusivity is watchword here, I think.
Inclusivity alongside health and safety, no doubt, Victor.
Exactly.
Some of these new modes of transport are as dangerous as the motorbikes that are flying along the road. But
yeah, but if the route is shared, if people don't view it as their entitlement, you know, it's easy for one user group to view it, you know, to become entitled, and there's a danger there because they then could become a risk to others, or they could deter others from using it.
Well, thank you so much.
Cyclists.
Thank you so much for all your encouragement, your wisdom, the information, the knowledge, for fielding the questions, Victor. It's been a joy to have you with us.